If you had told me a year ago that I'd be here, pacing the cold floor of my living room at 3 in the morning, I would have laughed it off as paranoid nonsense. But the strange thing about betrayal is that it doesn't always strike out of nowhere. It creeps in, insidious, a small shadow that gradually covers every part of your life. For us, it started with the smallest things, ones that would seem petty if I told anyone else about them. And maybe they were, but they were also things I couldn't ignore. And slowly, they started to piece together a picture I didn't want to see. It began with an ordinary Tuesday. She was at the table, smiling to herself as she typed on her phone. I remember watching her, thinking how happy she looked in that moment, almost like she was basking in some private little joke or memory. Her face, lit by the dim glow of her screen, looked younger somehow, as if a weight had lifted from her shoulders. And for a fleeting second, I thought maybe it was me, that I had somehow managed to make her happy in a way I hadn't in years. But when I asked her, casually, what she was smiling at, she glanced up in that almost imperceptible way, her expression shuddering just a fraction too quickly. "Oh, it's nothing," she said, setting her phone face down. "Just an old friend." She laughed it off, her tone light, but there was something guarded in her eyes, a sliver of hesitation I hadn't seen before. I should have brushed it off, forgotten about it, gone back to the million other things that clutter up the average weekday. But the look on her face lingered, the way she'd set her phone down, as though hiding something, not from me but from herself. I knew that look. I'd seen it years ago, back when we were younger, back when she was still with someone else, and hadn't yet told me that I was the one she really wanted. For days I tried to ignore the feeling that something was off. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that I was being ridiculous. But the changes kept piling up, small things here and there, each one a little more obvious than the last. She was suddenly glued to her phone, her face lighting up at odd hours. She'd laugh at things she wouldn't share with me, shrugging them off with vague explanations that felt just a shade too convenient. And then, slowly, she began slipping away in ways that were harder to pinpoint. She was distracted, distant in a way that made the space between us feel like a chasm. One night, I tried to bring it up, tried to gauge where she was. I sat across from her in our dimly lit kitchen, the hum of the fridge the only sound in the silence that had settled between us. "Are you okay?" I asked, searching her face for some kind of answer. She looked up, almost surprised, as though I'd jolted her out of some deep reverie. "Of course," she said, her voice light, her smile easy. But it was a different smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. She looked at me, and I realized that she was looking through me, as though I were a stranger who had wandered into her life. It was then that I started to wonder, to really question the foundation of everything we'd built. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, that maybe she was just stressed, maybe it was work or something else that had nothing to do with me. But every time I told myself that, I'd see another little sign. She'd go to bed later than usual, staying up with her phone screen casting a faint glow across her face. When I'd ask her what she was doing, she'd mumble something about checking emails or reading. But it felt hollow. The kind of answer you give when you've already decided the other person doesn't need to know the real one. I began to look back over our years together, questioning moments I'd never questioned before. Was this inevitable? Had I missed the signs all along? I thought about the way we used to be, the late nights, the conversations that would stretch on for hours, the way we'd make each other laugh until our sides hurt. It was almost painful to remember how it had once been, back when I was the one she'd look at with that secret little smile. Then, one evening, I walked in on her whispering into her phone in the kitchen, her back to me. I'd come home earlier than usual, and she hadn't heard me come in. She laughed, a soft, intimate laugh that felt like a blade twisting in my gut. She was talking to someone in a way that she hadn't talked to me in months. The moment she realized I was there, she went silent, quickly ending the call and flashing me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Who was that?" I asked, my voice coming out sharper than I'd intended. She looked at me, her face carefully blank. "Just an old friend from work," she said, the same excuse she'd given me before. And it was then that it clicked, the faint memory surfacing. Jacob, her first love, from her first job, the man who'd once had her heart before she'd met me. My heart pounded as I connected the pieces. Jacob, the man I'd almost forgotten about, the one she'd told me stories about back when we were first together, like a distant, harmless memory. He was just someone from her past, someone who had faded into the background of our life together. Until now. I wanted to believe she was innocent, that there was nothing going on beyond a simple reconnection, but the way she'd laughed, the way her face had lit up in a way it hadn't in years, I couldn't shake it. It was the look of someone falling in love, or at the very least, feeling something she shouldn't. That night, as I lay next to her in bed, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with every possible scenario. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to demand an answer, to hear the truth. But I was terrified of what she might say, of the possibility that this wasn't just in my head, that she was already slipping away from me and into the arms of someone else, someone who had once meant everything to her. So instead, I did nothing. I lay there in the darkness, the silence pressing down on me, my mind a chaotic mess of suspicion and dread. And as the hours ticked by, I felt something in me begin to fracture, a quiet shattering that I knew I'd never be able to mend. I had never felt so alone. It wasn't as if I planned to confront her that night. I didn't wake up thinking, "This is it, today's the day I demand answers." If anything, I'd been holding back for weeks, playing out 100 different conversations in my mind, each one ending in ways I didn't want to imagine. I'd told myself that if I just waited, if I kept my suspicions quiet, maybe it would all disappear. Maybe I'd catch her smiling at her phone one day, and she'd show me some innocent message from a friend, and I'd laugh at how paranoid I'd been. But that night, something in me snapped. I couldn't keep carrying around the weight of it, couldn't keep pretending that I was okay when everything felt like it was unraveling. It was late. We were sitting at the table, the soft light from the lamp casting shadows on her face as she scrolled through her phone. I watched her, my heart pounding, and I knew I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Are you still talking to him?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, my voice sounding harsher than I'd intended. But there it was, the question that had been sitting on the edge of my tongue for weeks. She froze, her fingers hovering over the screen, and I could see the flicker of surprise, of panic in her eyes. She looked up at me, her face carefully blank, and I knew that whatever came next would change everything. "Who?" she asked, but her voice was strained, and we both knew it was a pointless question. She knew exactly who I was talking about. "Jacob," I said, forcing the name out like a bitter pill. "Your old friend from work. Are you still talking to him?" There was a long silence, one that seemed to stretch on forever, and in that silence I could feel my heart splintering. I wanted her to deny it, to look me in the eyes and laugh at how ridiculous I was being, but she didn't. She just sat there, staring down at her phone, her hands trembling ever so slightly. "Yes," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and final, and in that moment I felt something in me die. "How long?" I asked, my voice hoarse. I didn't even recognize myself anymore. I sounded like a stranger, a broken version of the man I used to be. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the wall, as if she couldn't bear to meet my eyes. "A few months," she said quietly. He reached out to me just to catch up. It was innocent at first, I swear. We were just talking, just reminiscing, but—" Her voice trailed off, and I could feel the rest of the sentence hanging in the air, unspoken but clear as day. "But what?" I pressed, my voice shaking. "But it stopped being innocent." She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't want this to happen. It It just did. Her voice cracked, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I'd loved for so many years, the woman I thought I'd known, inside and out. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She was someone else, someone who had betrayed me in ways I couldn't begin to understand. "Did you sleep with him?" The words tasted like acid in my mouth, each syllable a knife to my heart. I didn't want to ask it, didn't want to know the answer, but I had to. I needed to hear it, to finally confront the truth I'd been dreading for so long. She looked at me, her eyes red and swollen, and I could see the guilt, the shame, written all over her face. "It was only once," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "It didn't mean anything. I don't love him. I love you." I wanted to laugh, to scream, to throw something across the room. She loved me. How could she say that, standing there with the weight of her betrayal hanging between us? How could she say she loved me when she had given herself to someone else, even if it was just once? "You love me," I repeated, my voice bitter. "You don't get to say that, not after what you did." She flinched, and for a brief, twisted moment, I felt a flicker of satisfaction at the pain in her eyes. But it was fleeting, replaced by a wave of sorrow so deep I thought it might drown me. This was the woman I had built my life with, the woman I had loved with every fiber of my being, and now, in the space of a single conversation, she had become a stranger, someone I couldn't recognize. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said, her voice breaking. I don't know. I was feeling lost and he was there, and it all just happened so fast. I didn't mean to betray you." "But you did," I said, my voice a whisper. "You did betray me." She started to cry, her shoulders shaking as she tried to explain herself, to justify the unjustifiable. She told me about how she'd felt disconnected, how she'd been struggling with feelings she couldn't explain, how reconnecting with Jacob had felt like finding a part of herself she thought she'd lost, but all I could hear was the sound of my heart breaking, each word another fracture, another piece of me shattering into a million pieces. I wanted to understand, to find some way to make sense of it all, but there was no logic, no reason that could justify what she had done. She had chosen to go to him, to give him a piece of herself that should have been mine, and no amount of excuses could change that. As she kept talking, her words blurring together, in a mess of apologies and regrets, I found myself drifting, my mind retreating from the reality in front of me. I looked around our kitchen, at the table where we'd shared so many meals, at the photos on the walls, at the little details that had once made this house feel like a home. And now it was all tainted, every memory stained by the knowledge of her betrayal. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pushed back my chair, standing up abruptly, and she fell silent, looking up at me with tear-streaked cheeks, her eyes wide with fear. "I need some air," I muttered, not even waiting for her response, as I turned and walked out the door. The night air hit me like a shock, cold and unforgiving, but it wasn't enough to numb the pain that was tearing me apart. I wandered through the empty streets, my mind racing, replaying her words over and over in my head. She didn't love him, she'd said. It was just a mistake, a moment of weakness. But that didn't matter. She had still chosen him, chosen to be with him in a way that she was supposed to be with me. And that choice, that betrayal, was something I could never forget. I don't know how long I walked, lost in the darkness, my thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess of anger and sorrow. By the time I finally made my way back home, the house was silent, and she was waiting for me, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "I'm sorry," she whispered, as I stood in the doorway, the words barely more than a breath. "I know I can never take it back. I know I've hurt you more than I can ever make up for. But please, please don't leave me. I love you." I looked at her, at the woman I had once thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, and I felt nothing but emptiness. I wanted to forgive her, to somehow find it in my heart, to move past this, to believe that we could rebuild what had been broken. But I knew, deep down, that things would never be the same. Without a word, I turned and walked past her, heading for the spare room. As I closed the door behind me, shutting her out, I felt a strange sense of relief, mingled with the unbearable ache of loss. This was the beginning of the end, and I knew it, but there was no going back. Not now, not after everything she had taken from me. The days that followed her confession were a blur, a tangled mess of raw, unfiltered emotions that I couldn't even begin to sort through. It felt as though I'd been living in a house built on lies, and now I was stumbling through the wreckage, trying to find my footing in a world that had crumbled around me. There was anger, of course, blinding, burning anger that felt like it would consume me if I let it. But there was also sadness, a deep, aching sorrow that settled in my bones, refusing to let go. And then there was something even worse. Emptiness, a hollow feeling that gnawed at me, reminding me constantly of what I'd lost. The first morning after our confrontation, I woke up alone in the guest room, the ache of her absence as real and tangible as any physical wound. The bed felt cold, foreign, and I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying her words over and over again. She'd told me she loved me, that it had been a mistake, that it hadn't meant anything. But those words felt meaningless now, hollow promises from a version of her that no longer existed. When I finally got up, I found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee in her hands, her eyes red and swollen. She looked up when I walked in, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of hope in her gaze, as if she thought that maybe we could still salvage something from this wreckage. But I couldn't bring myself to look at her, couldn't bear to face the woman who had betrayed me in the most profound way imaginable. We lived in a strange, stilted silence after that, each of us moving through the house like ghosts, avoiding each other, avoiding the memories that lingered in every room. It was almost surreal, being in the same space, sharing the same roof, but feeling like we were worlds apart. I'd sit in the living room, staring blankly at the television, while she'd retreat to our bedroom, the weight of our unspoken words hanging heavy in the air between us. At night, I'd lie awake in the guest room, listening to the faint sounds of her crying through the walls. I wanted to hate her for what she'd done, wanted to feel nothing but rage and resentment. But in the quiet moments, when it was just me and the darkness, all I could feel was a deep, aching sadness, a hollow emptiness that seemed to consume me from the inside out. I tried to find solace in the familiar routines, clinging to the small comforts of daily life, as if they could somehow fill the void she'd left in me. I went to work, burying myself in tasks, trying to keep my mind occupied, trying to ignore the constant gnawing ache in my chest. But it was impossible to escape. Everywhere I looked, I was reminded of her, of the life we'd built together, of the love we'd once shared. Even the smallest things, the coffee mug she'd given me for my birthday, the scent of her perfume lingering in the hallway, the photographs on the walls, felt like cruel reminders, taunting me with memories of a life that no longer felt real. I couldn't escape her, couldn't escape the ghost of what we'd once had, and every time I looked at her, every time I caught a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye, I felt that hollow ache grow just a little bit deeper. One evening, about a week after the confrontation, she came to me, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with a desperate sadness. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "please let me explain. Let me make this right." I looked at her, feeling a surge of anger rise up in me, hot and bitter. "Explain?" I said, my voice cold. "What's there to explain? You chose him. You chose to betray me, to throw away everything we had. What explanation could possibly make that okay?" She flinched, her shoulders slumping as though my words had physically struck her. "I know I hurt you," she said, her voice shaking. "I know I can never take back what I did, but please, I love you. I want to fix this. I'll do anything to make it right." I wanted to believe her. Part of me ached to believe her, to hold on to the hope that maybe, somehow, we could find our way back to each other. But the memory of her betrayal, the image of her with him, lingered in my mind like a poison, tainting everything we'd once shared. "How can I ever trust you again?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "How can I look at you and not see what you did, not see him?" She didn't have an answer for that, and I didn't expect her to. She just looked at me, her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman I'd thought would be by my side forever. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone I could no longer recognize. Days turned into weeks, and the silence between us grew heavier, the distance wider. We tried counseling, sitting in a sterile office, sharing our story with a stranger who nodded and listened, offering advice, and encouragement. But the words felt empty, the advice hollow. No amount of therapy could erase the pain, could undo the betrayal, and every session only seemed to bring us further apart, each word, each forced smile, feeling like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. At times I thought about leaving, about packing up my things, and walking out the door, starting fresh somewhere far away from the memories, from the pain. But the thought of leaving, of abandoning everything we'd built together, felt like its own kind of betrayal, a final, irrevocable ending that I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Instead, I found myself drifting, moving through each day in a numb haze, clinging to the remnants of a life that no longer felt like my own. I'd sit in our living room, staring at the photographs on the walls, at the smiling faces frozen in time, a painful reminder of a happiness that now felt like a distant dream. And I'd wonder if it was all worth it, if the love we'd shared had ever been real, or if it had all been an illusion, a fragile facade that had shattered the moment she'd chosen him over me. There were moments, fleeting and rare, when I thought maybe we could make it through, that maybe, with time, we could rebuild something from the ruins. But those moments were always followed by the crushing weight of reality, the knowledge that the trust, the love, the foundation of our marriage had been irreparably damaged. Eventually, I realized that I couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep holding on to something that was already gone. So one evening, as we sat across from each other in the living room, the silence between us heavy and oppressive, I looked at her, really looked at her, and I knew it was time to let go. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I can't keep pretending that things will ever be the same, that we can just move past this and go back to the way we were." She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears, and for a moment I saw a flicker of understanding, of acceptance. She nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping, as though a great weight had been lifted from her. "I understand," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for any of this to happen." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say, nothing that could undo the damage, nothing that could make things right. We sat there in silence, two strangers bound together by the shattered remnants of a love that had once been everything. And as I looked at her, I felt a strange sense of relief, mingled with the unbearable ache of loss. The next morning I packed my bags, leaving behind the house, the memories, the life we'd once shared. As I walked out the door, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief, a sense of finality that was both comforting and devastating. I knew that this was the end, that there was no going back, no second chances. But in that moment, as I stepped into the unknown, I also felt a glimmer of hope, a small fragile spark that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to heal, to rebuild, to move forward. It wouldn't be easy. The scars would remain, a permanent reminder of the love and trust that had been broken. But as I walked away from the life I'd known, I knew that I was finally free, free to find myself again, free to build a new life, a life untouched by the pain and betrayal that had once consumed me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of peace, a quiet, tentative hope, that maybe someday I'd find my way back to happiness.